So welcome to the next week. This time I want to talk about post-classical civilizations. I put this time period in about 300 AD to 1450 AD. This is where I like to tell the students that actually these dates that I'm giving to them are not absolute by any means. In fact, historians debate about this all the time. Many historians see a lot of the links between these different time periods as actually overlapping with the previous time period and going way back or way forward. So that really opens up some possibilities for debates in the class about what are the themes of the time period and how much do they compare or contrast to other time periods. That can open up some good possibilities for activities. However, in this particular case, I'm going to say post-classical civilization starts about 300 AD. That's sort of where Rome is collapsing, and it goes up to 1450 AD because that's right before European exploration. So here's where I want to start talking about these big land-based empires and some of the themes that come up during this time period as they are building up the post-classical period, which oftentimes we think of as being the feudalist time period. So the first one is the dominant civilization, and that is Chinese expansion. During this time period, China is going to expand outwards, and the three major dynasties I want to point out with that are the Sui, Tang, and the Song. They're going to expand into Tibet, Manchuria, Vietnam, and Korea. And as they do that, they create one of the basic themes of this time period, and that's tributary states. A tributary state is a state in which an empire goes in, conquers smaller states, and then uses those states for taxation. We're going to see this across the world at this time period. It's a common theme, and I think the reason why is expansion of empires and agriculturally based empires. I also like to introduce the concepts of sphere of influence and hegemony. These concepts mean that one empire or one dynasty, or today one nation state, has a huge amount of influence over a particular region of the world. So this allows us to bring in that concept for this time period, but it will also influence future time periods as well. As China is expanding outwards, they are going to butt up right against some major civilizations that are very important. These are smaller nomadic civilizations, and they are known as the Steppe People. The Steppe People live right above the Mongolian region. It's a very difficult region to live in, and this provides us with a number of different civilizations that will be very important for the time period for the spread of culture. Again, these are the Steppe People, and the Steppe People that we're talking about live in the plateaus above Afghanistan and Mongolia. I like to use as the example for the kids where soldiers are fighting today right above Afghanistan and Pakistan in that very high altitude region with the mountain ranges that are there, to give them an image. The people who are there are tribal groups. They are competing over extremely scarce resources. And as they are doing this, they end up conquering other civilizations. Our major examples are the Jurchens and the Mongols. The Jurchens are known for conquering the Song dynasty in China. The Mongols are known for expanding out throughout the entire globe, the entire Asian part of the globe at this time period. So that brings up then the Mongols themselves, who are extremely important in world history for understanding how they change things. And so we start off here with Chinggis Khan or Genghis Khan, who is the central charismatic leader who unites the Mongol tribes. I like using the last scene of the movie Mongol to give them a sense of this, to give them a sense of how charismatic he was as a leader and how he changed military fighting in order to unite different tribes together. He expands out into Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Some of the reasons why he's able to do this. First of all, he creates new technologies like the saddle and stirrups. This is really important. The Mongols are going to be able to ride into areas on horses and fire bows and arrows at the same time as they're riding. This was a completely new innovation that other civilizations were just not used to. However, one of the interesting things about the Mongols is their ability to ally with poorer peasants. And this allows us to talk about feudalism and about how peasants were tied to the land or to the masters. And while this really kept them in place for a long time, it also made a lot of civilizations very vulnerable to the Mongols, who would come in and they would provide peasants with a choice, either join up with the Mongols or end up dying. The peasants oftentimes did join up with the Mongols because the Mongols in essence were playing the form of liberation. Which really brings up a question. Were the Mongols barbarians, or were they the bringers of civilization? Obviously, they did many barbaric things, and so it's very obvious to kind of lay that out there for the kids. But at the same time, we can kind of balance that off by asking the big question. If the Mongols ended up spreading so much culture and civilization, did they really connect civilizations together? That becomes important, of course, now with the Mongols coming up against Europe. And with Europe, now we want to get into what happened with the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome falls in 476 AD. that leads to a fragmentation of Rome. The major leader that I point out to the kids is Charlemagne, who established the boundaries of the new European kingdoms. That's important for a lot of reasons. One, many of the boundaries he established that are sort of France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire or Germany become the boundaries somewhat of today. Europe also at this time period creates the Hanseatic League for trade across the Mediterranean. So this allows us now to connect Europe up to the other major trade routes. And we're able to now to discuss the Great Schism between Byzantium and Western Rome. And this is where I can get into the two civilizations and talk about their differences. Western Rome establishing the Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium under Justinian the Great with Justinian's law code having a different type of theology, a different type of way of organizing their society, and how this creates a break within Europe between West and East, which of course then opens us up to the major events of the post-classical age, and that's the Crusades. So, what do we do with the Crusades to introduce this in context? Well, our three major groups are the Turks, Byzantium, and Western Rome. Each one has their own interests. The Turks are an example of the steppe people, again, diffusing culture and creating empires. Byzantium is an example of the civilization on the crossroads of trade. You'll notice here Byzantium or Constantinople is right between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. They do try to expand out into northern Africa, but they fail. So they become primarily a trading area, which means that they become very wealthy, but also very vulnerable. Western Rome is under Urban II, and he sees an opportunity for uniting Europe at this time period by going in and conquering Jerusalem. So what are the impact then of the Crusades? Well, for Europeans, the impact is definitely not winning, but there is a huge impact for them in ideas for the long term. And the impact is this. When the European people came back from the Crusades, they had lost, but they brought back books that they found from the Greeks that had been in Arab libraries. And when they brought this back, you'll see here on the left, Aristotle, one of the great Greek philosophers, was incorporated by the man on the right, St. Thomas Aquinas, into Catholic theology. The notion that Thomas Aquinas believed was that Catholic theology could be defended by using Aristotelian philosophy. In the long run, what he ends up doing is he lays the groundwork for things like the Scientific Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, because now a whole bunch of different thinkers are going to try and use this notion of rationality to justify their agreement or disagreement with the Catholic Church. What about for the Muslims? For the Muslims, believe it or not, the Crusades don't really have much meaning, at least not right afterwards. For the Muslims, the world becomes separated into three great land empires that we'll discuss in a moment. But right after the Crusades, the Muslims were basically the winners. It really was not a time period for them of incredible bitterness. However, Crusades will become important 2 to 3 centuries later when the Ottoman Empire starts to collapse. At that point, Islamic nationalism and the believement in purity movements arises. And the big leader of the Crusades for the Muslims is a man named Saladin, who conquers Jerusalem or takes back Jerusalem from the Crusaders. He will become mythologically a hero for the Muslims, and to this day really is now seen as being somebody who could stand up against the West and maybe could arise again today. So let's go through then those Muslim empires. They are known as the Gunpowder Empires. The first is the Ottoman Empire, huge empire, Sunni empire that stretches from northern Africa to Iraq. Their big issue is how to manage different ethnicities and religious groups. They had at the time Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and it's a question of, how do you manage that in such a large empire? And this really gets into, I think, some really good discussions with the kids about how the Ottoman Empire was actually extremely good at finding ways of co-opting or bringing people into their empire, and for their time period was known to be pretty relatively tolerant overall. There were two main tools that were used, one called the Janissary Corps and the other called the Devshirme. Janissary Corps was basically, the Ottomans would take children from local Jewish and Christian communities, they would force them into Constantinople, where they would be co-opted into Islam, raised in Islam, and then given a military leadership position. Okay, so what does this do? Well, it means that these kids now were a part of the empire and given a position in the empire. Their parents obviously lost their kids, but the parents were allowed locally to maintain their religious culture and their political culture at home in places called millets. So this kind of co-opted the people in. Another example, the Devshirme. The Devshirme is the harem, and typically in stereotypical fashion, Westerners have seen the harem or the Devshirme as a place for lusty sexual appetites of the Sultan. Actually, there was a French Catholic priest who at one point visited the Devshirme, and when he came away, he said that the closest analogy for him of the Devshirme was a nunnery in Europe, or a convent in Europe. The reason why, he said, was that most of the time the women in the Devshirme would do things like be taught how to read, they would learn from religious texts, and they would teach one another. He said it was actually a place where women oftentimes got freedom and education. Now, of course, the Devshirme at the same time was a place where the Sultan would use these women to eventually reproduce in order to try to create an heir for the throne. And an even darker side of the Devshirme is that when they eventually chose whoever was going to be the next Sultan, all of the brothers of that Sultan were executed on the spot in order to make sure that there would be no civil war. So I don't want to present to the kids that there's only a light side. I want them to see the balance here. But I do want them to see that the Ottomans were trying to use these different tools to try to manage all these religious ethnicities. And it wasn't quite the stereotypical way that most people have thought in the past. So then there are the Safavids. The Safavids are a very small empire, and they are located in Iraq and Iran. They're a Shiite empire. They're landlocked, and they had to fight with the Ottomans, who had a navy. So in order to do that, they moved their capital to Baghdad, and then after that, they centered their empire around Shiism and suppressed the Sufi sect. So this is a great chance to bring up the different sects of Islam, Sufi, Shia, and Sunni, talk about that, and also talk about how religion was used in order to create nationality. Which brings up the last major gunpowder empire, and that's the Mughals. The Mughals were led by, originally, the major leaders, Akbar the Great. And Akbar the Great, like in some of these other empires, had to find a way to bring together all these different ethnicities. And he did that by creating the divine faith. The divine faith was a faith that united all of the different religious faiths, Hindu and Muslim and Christian, under common principles, which worked for a while until his grandson Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was a strong Muslim. He saw his grandfather, Akbar the Great, as washing away the importance of Islam. And so he tried to purify it by tearing down Hindu temples, by reinstating the jizya tax, and by not allowing for intermarriage between Muslims and Hindus. That created conflict within India, and it eventually allows us to talk a little bit about how the British came in and manipulated that conflict in order to eventually take over. So with all these empires, now we can get into the real huge theme of this time period, and that is trade routes. At this time period, there are several of them. There's the Silk Road, which was originally created in the classical area by the Han Empire, connecting over time with the Roman Empire. The Indian Ocean, connecting China with India and East Africa. The Mediterranean, that connected Europe out to the Silk Road and to the sub-Saharan trade route. And the Andean Mountain. The Andean Mountain trade route, of course, is on the other side of the world. I explained to the kids how that's very isolated, but that Peruvian mountain range really did allow for trade between the Inca, the Aztec, and the North Americans. So that now allows us to go to the other part of the world, and now we can talk about what was happening in Mesoamerica, very isolated from the rest of the world, but actually dramatically progressive in many ways in the sense that it was so huge. In fact, at the time period, the Azteca had about 2 to 3 million people in their civilization. To give you a sense about the proportion of that, out in Europe, there's about 10,000 people in most of the kingdoms that lived out there. So this is a massive kingdom. It started off really with the Toltecs and the Olmecs. They formed the original trading empires of Mesoamerica and then disappeared. We don't know why, but we can guess it was probably environmental reasons. After them, the Mayans created a confederation of warring and trading kingdoms. Again, disappeared. We don't know why. Probably environmental reasons. But the Azteca are going to fill that gap in Mexico. And some of the big things they do is that they also, like China, created an empire based upon tributary states, conquering smaller groups, using them for taxation. But they also, in the middle of this desert, are going to create a very organized leadership that creates chinapas. Chinapas are these irrigation systems that take water above ground and hold on to them and then use them for this massive civilization. It was a huge innovation that took place, and it demonstrates, again, this kind of like centralization of government. Just below them is the Inca. The Inca live in the kingdom of Tuantansuyu. And in that kingdom arises out of religious movements called the Chauvin and the Mochi. They established an expansive empire in the Peruvian mountains. They also created a tributary state, so they expand throughout that region. And they have an extensive trade route in the Andean Mountains. So we get to talk about how, on the one hand, they were very isolated. On the other hand, they did this amazing job of creating a messaging route throughout the Andean Mountains. In fact, it's said that their particular postal system actually rivals our postal system for our time period. So it's this amazing stretch within the Andean Mountains. So, of course, one of the big issues the kids want to know about, and I usually use this issue just to get them excited about this part, is about human sacrifice. How do we explain the fact, and we've seen it in the movies, about human sacrifice with the Aztecs and the Incas. One of the key movies I like to show a clip from is Mel Gibson's movie on human sacrifice. What's interesting about it, and I like to go into it with the kids, is that Mel Gibson's human sacrifice is about the Mayans. The Mayans actually hardly had any human sacrifice whatsoever. So Mel Gibson really gets the movie wrong. The Aztecs and the Incas did, but the Mayans didn't. So that allows us to form some context and then ask the big question, why do we see human sacrifice taking place within the Aztec and the Inca and not in a lot of other civilizations? So now we can get into issues like isolation, how the isolation of the Aztecs and Incas in this desert or mountain context does not allow for the flowing of ideas that might challenge that. Also, scarce resources in desert climates could be a reason why. But lastly, I like to explain to them about the ideology of cyclical time. The notion that the Aztecs and the Incas living in a farming society had developed this idea that there were 7 cycles of time, and each cycle of time was based upon the farming notions and would eventually be restored by the god Quetzalcoatl. So this cyclical time gives the sense to the people of that time period that they have to give back to their god's blood in order to keep the cycle going. So this allows us to look into numerous different reasons why this might happen and get away from like that old notion of they are just barbaric. No question about it. Human sacrifices are barbaric practice. We know that at a conservative estimate, the Aztecs did about 200,000 people lost their lives to human sacrifice. So I want the kids to know about that, but I want them to understand how there might be some deeper reasons why that took place within those civilizations. Of course, then we want to contrast that with Western Africa, and that allows us to get into Mansa Musa, who organized the farmers in Western Africa into a major empire in Mali. He's then going to connect Mali through Western Africa up into the Middle East and the sub-Saharan trade route. One of the big reasons they're able to do that is the finding of the camel for transportation. And this also allows us to talk about both trade for gold as well as the beginnings of the first major transcontinental slave trade, and that is the trans-Saharan slave route. Now we go to the opposite side of Africa, and we talk about Eastern Africa, and that allows us to talk about Ethiopia, which is our only Christian community within Africa at this time period. It's going to be very important in the long run because Ethiopia will resist imperialism, and they're able to do that because they form alliances with the Christian community up in Europe. It also is a demonstration of that Christian-Muslim tension at the time period between empires and states in Africa, and it allows us to connect, as I said, to long-term alliances and the issue of colonization. So, what are our themes then for the post-classical era, unlike the classical era? First one that I want them to have is the rise of these land-based empires that compete for land expansion and resources. Second one, feudalistic relationships are common. We see this throughout the world, the notion of a land run by vassals, worked on by peasants, just different names across the world. Third, expansion leads to tensions, especially with the steppe people who diffuse culture from one region to the next. Fourth, settled land-based empires start to form trade on land and oceans, leading to greater diffusion of ideas. And fifth, societies are going to debate whether or not they want to expand or remain culturally pure. This last one is a big one for me. It's going to become important in the colonization period. Societies that tend to expand tend to do better because they share ideas and they bring in new technologies. Those that try to remain culturally pure tend to fall off over time because they don't innovate, they don't bring in new ideas. Some possible questions you might want to bring up with the kids leading up to essay questions. Comparison and contrast. Compare and contrast the ways in which different empires try to manage and assimilate various ethnic and religious groups. We see these huge land-based empires oftentimes having to deal with how do they bring in all these different groups of people. And last up, change and continuity over time. Analyze how trade both changed and supported the social and economic interactions between land-based empires. Trade is really huge during this time period. It's a major theme. I think the reason why is that in the past, people saw world history as sort of civilizations developing on their own. Today, we know that's really not the truth. There was a lot of cultural diffusion, so that's a big theme in world history. So those are some of our big themes when we talk about post-classical age. Our next one we're going to jump into next week is going to deal with exploration leading all the way up to imperialism. Thanks a lot, and please send me questions or get into the discussions about these issues this week so that we can talk about how to organize your lesson plans for these major new units.